Thank you very much. I'm Gun Lee from Empathic Computing Lab from University of South Australia. Our title of our paper is a user study on MR remote collaboration using live 360 video. We are all familiar with face-to-face communication over a medium such as a video call. And recently, as the wearable devices are becoming more common, sharing experiences from a first-person perspective is also getting common as well. Not only sharing experiences, but these kind of devices started to catch augmented reality cues so that it could be also used for a collaborative task as well. For example, Microsoft has a HoloLens version of Skype where you can not only see the remote person's view, but also can draw annotations or give instructions through augmented cues as well. So first-person video sharing is good for sharing experiences and collaboration tasks. But the downside is the remote user's view is tied to the local user's camera so that they cannot really have a control of where they want to look at. So most recently, Kasara and Erkimoto have been proposing using 360 video or a wearable 360 camera to share their experience with a remote person, focusing on the telepresence and sharing experience. And nowadays, commercial social networking systems are now supporting streaming of 360 live video, although the experience is mostly one-directional, so rather than a bi-directional active collaboration. So most recently, Tang et al. Have conducted a user study where they wanted to look at how 360 video chat would be useful and what kind of shortcomings there would be. And through their observational study, they found one of the missing thing was nonverbal communication cues, especially understanding where the other person is looking at and other type of nonverbal communication cues. And our research looks into how we can use AR or MR cues to help collaborating or communicating through 360 live communication. Our system has three main features: view independence, view awareness cues, and hand gesture communication cues. And it will come back. No. Go to the next slide. No. Voila. I'll try to replug my HDMI cable. Or maybe I'll try previous slide. Some problem with it. Anyway, view independence is basically looking at when, definitely has a problem with this slide, but anyway, view independence is about when you're wearing a wearable camera, and even though it's a 360 camera, if the person sharing the 360 experience turns their head, the camera also turns around so that the remote person who is wearing a VR goggle will be seeing the turning of the environment. It's not really according to his head motion. So what we're doing is using a sensor data or tracking data from a wearable device and using that sensor information to tilt back the 360 environment so that it will look as a leveled 360 environment, independent from the person wearing the 360 video. The second feature we support is view awareness cues. One of the problems with 360 video sharing is you're not aware of where the other person is looking at. So we use a simple view frame rectangle on each side so that they can understand where the other person is looking at. And the downside of this type of view frame rectangle is it's useless once it gets out of the view. So we also use screen space cue, a small arrow indicating towards the view frame when the view frame is out of the view, and the arrow size is size proportional to the angular distance to the frame. Last but not least, hand gesture cues, one of the representative nonverbal communication cues, and for capturing the local person's or the host person's hand gesture is naturally done by a 360 camera, but on the other way around, the VR user uses a hand tracking sensor, and then we visualize the virtual hand on the other side, which is the AR user. So it supports various hand poses, and also when the hand is outside of the view, we use a halo technique to indicate the virtual hand is out of the view. We've got a short video demo of our system. Due to the time frame, it's a very short video. It's a remote view in the VR environment, looking at live stream augmented with visual cues. And as you can see here, the view frame indicating the remote user's view, and the hand, virtual hand cue working as also showing up when the hand is outside of the view. So we've done a few user testing. One of the first preliminary testing was on the halo, how halo could be useful for understanding where the hand is. And we took a few participants to find and tell the pose of a randomly placed virtual hand outside of the field of view with simple paper, rock, scissors gesture. And the results show that it's half the time of the searching task. And we note that this was when the participants were aware of there is a virtual hand somewhere around them. But in the real world case, when you are communicating in a live situation, then there is a chance that they won't be aware of if they have to look at the hand or not, so it could be worse. Our main user study had two research questions. One is around how would providing view independence when sharing live 360 camera video affect the remote collaboration. So the main independent variable was view independency, and two levels with either the view being dependent, person sharing the 360 video, or independent using the sensor information. And it was a within subject design. We measured task performance, co-presence, and mental load and discomfort. And for the second research question, we questioned how would mixed reality visual cues overlaid onto the shared live video camera, live panorama would help users collaborating in different roles. And this part was done as an explorative study rather than trying to rank and pick which cue is the best. We thought it was better to be done in an explorative way so that we can understand each of the cues, how they are useful for communication. The user study environment was an office room divided into two sections with a physical divider, and the task space on the host side or the local user side included an L-shaped table and several shelves. And the host user was standing in the middle of that environment, and the guest user or the remote guest user were seated on a turning chair wearing a VR goggle. The user study task was in a style of remote expert collaboration. It was a task to find a set of target objects in the task space and place them on the desk. The target objects were 54 sticky notes with different symbols, so that they had to communicate with each other, so the remote person will explain what kind of symbol they are looking for using any of the cues they are provided, and then they have to collaborate for the symbol, and then the local person has to pick up that sticky note and bring it to the table. And obviously the target objects were shuffled around and placed randomly per trial. We had 12 participants. They were all recruited in pairs so that they knew each other well without having problem with communicating or collaborating with each other. Each of the participants experienced both host and the guest side as well, so that was another within subject factor we had. In terms of results, task performance didn't have a significant result. We initially expected that independent view would help the two users exploring the environment separately, but there was an overhead of once one of the users had found, then the other user has to follow up and catch up and do the rest of the task, which is taking the note to the desk. So in the end, it didn't turn out to be significant. But we did find a significant effect of view independency on the co-presence, which the independent view had a higher co-presence level than the dependent view. In terms of mental load, the two conditions of view independency didn't have a significant difference, although the independent condition had a slightly lower rating. But the role had a significant effect, which means the remote guest user had a higher mental load compared to the local host. In terms of discomfort measured by simulated stiffness, there was no significant difference between the conditions. most of the subscales of the simulator sickness questionnaire was below mid-range of simulator sickness. And by the way, this measure was only measured on the guest user who is wearing the VR goggle. In terms of user preference, most of the participants preferred independent view, having an independency of being free to turn their heads around, independent from each other. But interestingly, the local host users were more open to having both of the views, so they gave a tie to the two conditions. So asking a little bit more detail about their choices, for the independent view, remote guest users valued the independent view of being able to freely look around, which is an obvious one. The downside of the independent view that they mentioned was when they were wearing a VR goggle, because there was certain moments where the sensor information was not fully synchronized with the video, there was some jittery motion, and they thought there was a downside of the independent view. For the local host, they thought with the independent view, they were able to better communicate and collaborate with the remote guest. The downside, there was nothing specific mentioned for the independent view. On the other way around, for those who chose the dependent view were their preference. The remote guest mentioned having no jittery motion that I explained earlier was the better part of the dependent view, and also being easy to direct using the view rather than having to point at things. On the downside, the dependent view itself had a motion sickness because obviously when you are tied to someone else's view, that increases motion sickness. So in that sense, each of the conditions had their downsides of negatively affecting the motion sickness, and that's the results why we had no difference between the two conditions. And for the local host users, the dependent view was perceived as more focused. And since the two users' views were tied to each other. Looking into the visual cues, again, this was not an experimentally designed study, but we were more looking into explorative way of understanding how useful each of the cues were perceived by each of the users. And from when the participants were in the remote guest role, they didn't perceive much difference in terms of usefulness of each of the cues. But when they were in the local host side, they valued more of the view frame and the view arrow than the virtual hand. That also reflected into the results of asking them to pick the preferred visual cues. And the remote guest users mostly picked the view frame and then the second as a view arrow, while the local host had a reversed choice of having view arrow as a most preferred condition, while the view frame being the second, which was a little bit affected by the local host wearing a HoloLens display, having a narrow field of view. Many of the times, the view arrow was useful for understanding each other's view. So, in terms of qualitative feedback, again, the view frame was perceived as helping understanding each other's focus, and in some sense it also worked as a pointer, so not necessarily having to have a hand to point at things, but just looking at the view frame, you pretty much understand where the other person's focus is, and the view arrow helping following partner's focus and locating where the other user is looking at, while the virtual hand had a benefit of catching partner's attention and to indicate things with pointing. So in overall, the results was boiled down into 4 design implications. So first is when you're designing a 360 panorama-based remote collaboration system, better to use an independent view as a default, but also provide an option of switching to the dependent view as needed, such as when you want to catch an attention to the remote partner, then it would be good to have an option to switch between the two. Second, view awareness cues are not only helpful but very important to have, otherwise you will be lost about where the other person is looking at. Third is provide screen space registered cues such as the view arrow or the halo I explained earlier when using the HMDs with a narrow field of view such as HoloLens. Last but not least, virtual hands should be considered for more than pointing purpose. Our experiment included mostly visual search tasks, so mostly the hand was not really useful other than pointing things. but for social interaction, rich gestures might be a more value of the virtual hands. So that's our study. For future work, we are planning to test this in a real-world scenario, which is currently collaborating with a local power company. And we are looking into adding more richer nonverbal cues such as ray pointing, drawing annotations, showing facial expressions and eye gaze as well. And we are also looking into scaling up to many-to-many collaboration rather than one-to-one. Thank you very much, and I would like to thank South Australian government for funding this. Thank you.
Thank you, Gun. Are there any questions for Gun? It was a long day, wasn't it, eh? Okay. I would have one. It applies also to other research we have seen at this ISMAR. Why did you stop after 12 participants?
Because we had to submit the paper.
Well, I mean, you did quite extensive statistical analyses, and I think the power was simply not there, right?
Yeah. So again, we ran out of time submitting the paper, but also at the same time we had some results, meaningful results that we thought it was useful to share.
Yeah. Second question, similar, the simulator sickness questionnaire. How severe were the symptoms you measured with your participants?
Well, none of them threw up.
Okay.
So some of them had some light disorientation or discomfort, but fortunately none of them had a serious event. We are also, as a future work, we are looking into how to compensate the visualization of the physical environment to reduce the motion sickness, such as pausing the view when the motion is too fast or so. So we are also looking into that direction as well.
I mean, it applies to all of our interfaces. I mean, we always wonder why we tolerate that, right? And we say that people with a laptop interface, we wouldn't tolerate a single user feeling dizzy, I guess. But that's the nature of our research, right? Okay, let's thank Gun again. Thank you.
Thank you very much.